I never ordered myself a bride. The cold declaration struck like a hammer blow amid the Wyoming blizzard of 1871, just as Clara knocked upon the wooden door of Raven Hill Ranch, with a crumpled letter clutched in her hand. Behind her, the whiteout devoured the prairie. Before her, the steely eyes and still-worn wedding band of a man she had never met. But from the shadows, a 6-year-old girl suddenly stepped forward, her trembling hand clinging to Clara's skirt as she spoke her first word after 3 years of silence. "Mama." The moment froze the cabin in stunned stillness. Could the mistake of a single letter have opened the door to a destiny that could not be turned away? Wyoming, winter of 1871. Across the vast prairie, the wind shrieked like a funeral horn. Snow lay so heavy that sky and earth were swallowed into the same white void. And in the heart of that storm, a lone figure staggered forward, no more than a solitary stroke of ink upon an endless page of frost. Clara Whitmore clutched the wool scarf tight at her throat, yet the cold still cut through the weave and burned her lungs raw. Her hands were numb, the fingers stiff and senseless. Her boots dragged heavy with snow, each step a burden as though she carried a mountain upon her back. She scarcely knew where her feet were leading her, only the last words of the coachman at the final station. "Keep on a few more miles and you'll find Raven Hill Ranch. Knock at the door. They're expecting you." But the farther she went, the lonelier the road became. No sign of life, no track of man or beast. Fear gnawed her chest. What if the letter had been wrong? What if no one waited here at all? When her strength was nearly spent, she glimpsed it through the veil of snow, a roofline faint, a window leaking dim golden firelight. Relief cut sharp through her chest, and her knees nearly buckled. It was the lone beacon in the white fury. Gathering what breath remained, she stumbled forward until her hands touched the porch rail. The boards creaked beneath the weight of snow, groaning like a weary beast. She lifted her trembling hand and knocked upon the dark wood. The sound was swallowed by the gale, yet in the next heartbeat, the hinges moaned. The door swung wide. Framed within it stood a man, tall and broad, filling the threshold as though the house itself leaned upon his shoulders to withstand the storm. His face was lined and hard, his eyes a pale gray, cold as tempered steel. The wind whipped back his heavy coat, bearing a weathered colt at his hip, and upon his hand a tarnished wedding band. He fixed his gaze upon her, without surprise, without warmth. His voice came clipped, every word ground like stone. "You're at the wrong place. I never ordered myself a bride." Clara froze, her breath clouding the air, her whole body locked in ice. She fumbled at her satchel, drew out the crumpled letter, and held it to her chest. The ink still held clear, though the paper bore stains of travel. "Miss Clara Whitmore, to Raven Hill Ranch, Wyoming. Recipient, Mr. Carter." But this is Raven Hill Ranch, isn't it?" Her voice shook, tangled with cold and rising dread. The man gripped the doorframe, his eyes narrowing. Outside, the wind howled like wolves, battering the timber walls. He gave a small nod. "Aye, this is Raven Hill, but there's no Carter here. And me." His voice faltered, the steel dimming a breath. "I never called for a bride." The door seemed ready to close upon her, as final as a verdict. Clara swayed, the world tilting. Behind her the blizzard roared, a beast ready to devour. Before her loomed the cold door and the gray eyes of a stranger. Her heart thundered. each beat like a war drum. Months of fragile hope, the courage gathered to leave behind a wounded past in the East, all now tottering on the edge of ruin. If no one waited here, where else could she go? The moment stretched endless. Clara clutched the letter until it crumpled in her hand. Her eyes stung with snow and tears. Yet within her, a whisper rose. Do not turn away. Do not yield. She held her ground, lifted her gaze into his, and within that frost-gray stare she glimpsed not only refusal, but something shuttered deeper, an old grief, unhealed and buried. The storm screamed, driving snow in wild flurries across the porch. Clara knew if she turned back, the journey would end in death. But stepping forward, she had no notion what awaited. Behind her was the devouring blizzard. Before her, a man still wearing his wedding ring. And caught between them, she, a lost traveler clutching a letter that might well be a lie, yet was her final hope. Her fingers crushed the paper to near shreds. The gale stabbed her back with icy blades. Only one thought rang clear. If not here, I have nowhere left to live. And so she stood, caught in the storm, facing the steel-gray eyes of Thomas McAllister, the man who swore he had never summoned her at all. The wind outside roared as if it meant to tear the cabin down. Thomas still stood, barring the doorway, one hand gripping the wood, the other hovering by the Colt at his hip. His eyes had yet to leave Clara when a sound stirred from the shadows within. Footsteps, light and faltering, less like walking than the timid groping of something small and unsure. Clara startled, her gaze pulled into the darkness behind him. Out of it stepped a child, a girl of about 6, hair black and tangled, brushing her shoulders, clad in a faded pale blue nightdress, her bare feet blanched from the cold. She moved forward, heedless of the wind, unshaken by the frost, her eyes fixed on Clara as though the rest of the world had ceased to be. The moment froze the room. Thomas stiffened, his gray eyes widening in disbelief, his whole frame taut as a drawn bow. Clara exhaled sharply, unable to think, as the little girl reached her, a trembling hand clutching the hem of her skirt, desperate to anchor her there. The child's eyes shone, wet and storm-bright, as though holding another tempest inside. Her dry lips parted, quivering, and the faintest whisper escaped. God sent me a mother. The words were so fragile they nearly vanished into the howl of the wind. Yet Clara heard them clear, each syllable squeezing her heart in a merciless grip. Thomas stood stricken, his hand still upon the gun, forgotten. His throat closed as though a stone lodged there. 3 years, 3 long years since the day his wife vanished. 3 years in which his daughter had not spoken a single word. Doctors, preachers, neighbors had all tried and failed. Ellie's silence had been absolute, and now, before a stranger, the child's voice had broken free. The air in the cabin seemed to crack. The wind pressed harder through the open door, carrying snowflakes that melted into cold rivulets upon the floorboards. Clara looked down at the girl, her body trembling not from cold, but from the shock that rattled her soul. She had not expected a welcome, least of all from a child she had never seen. You. Clara bent toward her, but the words failed in her throat. Ellie only clung tighter, as if fearing she might vanish with the storm. At last Thomas moved, halting, and knelt beside his daughter, his voice ragged with awe. Ellie! But the girl did not turn to him. Her tear-filled eyes clung to Clara's face, a silent plea too raw to deny. Clara drew a breath, her frozen hands stretching out, settling lightly on the child's shoulders. Her skin was icy, yet a warmth surged from her small chest, searing through Clara's own cold. Time ceased. The storm's wail battered the walls, but in Clara's eyes there was only the fragile breath of the child holding her fast. Part of her longed to retreat, to remind them she was a stranger, brought here by mistake. Yet another part, stronger, unyielding, tightened her hold in answer. Thomas rose slowly. The hard edge of him was gone, replaced by something fractured and unguarded. Wonder, fear, and the faintest spark of hope he had forbidden himself for 3 years. The cabin sank into silence, broken only by the sigh of wind through the cracks. Clara felt it, that fragile thread binding the three of them. Not danger, but the tremor of something newly awakened. "Sir," she turned to Thomas, her voice unsteady. "The child." He silenced her with a shake of his head, lips pressed thin. In his shadowed eyes she glimpsed a fear unnamed, heavy and sharp. Ellie pressed her face into Clara's skirt, clutching harder. Clara lowered her hand to smooth the tangled hair, its strands smelling of wood smoke and snow, the scent of a home that had endured a long winter. The question hammered her mind. Why her? Why speak to me, and not to her father? Why should a stranger be called mother? Outside the blizzard howled, but within Clara another storm rose, fierce and unknown. Had she stumbled into a mistake fated to ruin her, or into a destiny waiting all along? Thomas exhaled, low and weary, before turning into the house. His voice bore the weight of stone. "Come in, before the storm takes us all." The door closed upon them. Outside, the wind cried over the prairie, long and mournful. Inside, the fire cast uneasy shadows across the walls, as if foretelling a story none dared to name. Clara clutched the battered letter. Ellie still clung to her skirt, and within Clara's heart came a sound she had not heard before. Not wind, but the tangled cry of fear and hope bound together. "I have arrived, but where have I come?" The wind outside roared as if it meant to tear the cabin down. Thomas still stood, barring the doorway, one hand gripping the wood, the other hovering by the colt at his hip. His eyes had yet to leave Clara when a sound stirred from the shadows within. Footsteps, light and faltering, less like walking than the timid groping of something small and unsure. Clara startled, her gaze pulled into the darkness behind him. Out of it stepped a child, a girl of about 6, hair black and tangled, brushing her shoulders, clad in a faded pale blue nightdress, her bare feet blanched from the cold. She moved forward, heedless of the wind, unshaken by the frost, her eyes fixed on Clara as though the rest of the world had ceased to be. The moment froze the room. Thomas stiffened, his gray eyes widening in disbelief, his whole frame taut as a drawn bow. Clara exhaled sharply, unable to think, as the little girl reached her, a trembling hand clutching the hem of her skirt, desperate to anchor her there. The child's eyes shone, wet and storm-bright, as though holding another tempest inside. Her dry lips parted, quivering, and the faintest whisper escaped. "God sent me a mother." The words were so fragile they nearly vanished into the howl of the wind, yet Clara heard them clear, each syllable squeezing her heart in a merciless grip. Thomas stood stricken, his hand still upon the gun, forgotten. His throat closed as though a stone lodged there. 3 years, 3 long years since the day his wife vanished. 3 years in which his daughter had not spoken a single word. Doctors, preachers, neighbors had all tried and failed. Ellie's silence had been absolute, and now, before a stranger, the child's voice had broken free. The air in the cabin seemed to crack. The wind pressed harder through the open door, carrying snowflakes that melted into cold rivulets upon the floorboards. Clara looked down at the girl, her body trembling not from cold, but from the shock that rattled her soul. She had not expected a welcome, least of all from a child she had never seen. "You." Clara bent toward her, but the words failed in her throat. Ellie only clung tighter, as if fearing she might vanish with the storm. At last Thomas moved, halting, and knelt beside his daughter, his voice ragged with awe. "Ellie!" But the girl did not turn to him. Her tear-filled eyes clung to Clara's face, a silent plea too raw to deny. Clara drew a breath, her frozen hands stretching out, settling lightly on the child's shoulders. Her skin was icy, yet a warmth surged from her small chest, searing through Clara's own cold. Time ceased. The storm's wail battered the walls, but in Clara's eyes there was only the fragile breath of the child holding her fast. Part of her longed to retreat, to remind them she was a stranger, brought here by mistake. Yet another part, stronger, unyielding, tightened her hold in answer. Thomas rose slowly. The hard edge of him was gone, replaced by something fractured and unguarded. Wonder, fear, and the faintest spark of hope he had forbidden himself for 3 years. The cabin sank into silence, broken only by the sigh of wind through the cracks. Clara felt it, that fragile thread binding the three of them. Not danger, but the tremor of something newly awakened. "Sir." She turned to Thomas, her voice unsteady. "The child." He silenced her with a shake of his head, lips pressed thin. In his shadowed eyes she glimpsed a fear unnamed, heavy and sharp. Ellie pressed her face into Clara's skirt, clutching harder. Clara lowered her hand to smooth the tangled hair, its strands smelling of wood smoke and snow, the scent of a home that had endured a long winter. The question hammered her mind. Why her? Why speak to me, and not to her father? Why should a stranger be called mother? Outside the blizzard howled, but within Clara another storm rose, fierce and unknown. Had she stumbled into a mistake fated to ruin her, or into a destiny waiting all along? Thomas exhaled, low and weary, before turning into the house. His voice bore the weight of stone. "Come in, before the storm takes us all." The door closed upon them. Outside, the wind cried over the prairie, long and mournful. Inside, the fire cast uneasy shadows across the walls, as if foretelling a story none dared to name. Clara clutched the battered letter. Ellie still clung to her skirt, and within Clara's heart came a sound she had not heard before. Not wind, but the tangled cry of fear and hope bound together. "I have arrived, but where have I come?" That night, when the door closed, the world outside vanished at once, leaving only the wind pounding the roof like distant war drums. Clara stepped in, her boots heavy with snow, the boards beneath her groaning with cold. The cabin's breath engulfed her, the damp scent of old wood, the acrid bite of smoke, the lingering ash clinging to a worn coat hung on the wall. To the right, the hearth burned low, flames gnawing at logs thick as her arm, popping and sparking, shadows stretching long across the walls. In the corner, a small wooden horse lay toppled, one wheel broken, dust gathering on its frame. Above the mantel, a portrait hung, an austere woman's face framed in dark wood, features fine yet eyes unsmiling. Clara halted before it but dared not linger. The likeness seemed to guard a secret, a silent warning that she stood in a space not meant for her. She set down her satchel, forcing her breath steady, though her chest still trembled with cold and unease. Thomas barred the door with a heavy beam and turned back. His words landed hard, clipped and forced. 3 years since my wife disappeared. The sentence cut like steel through the room. Clara gripped her skirt tight, silent, helpless to answer. His grief was a wound she could not reach, much less mend. She had not come to replace anyone, only to find shelter from the storm. Ellie clung to her side, small hand knotted in Clara's hem. The child's gaze fixed on the portrait above the hearth, as if hoping to conjure the mother lost for 3 long years. Clara lowered a hand to smooth the tangled black hair. The gesture bore no words, only the quiet promise that she would stay, at least through this night. Thomas strode to the fire, stirred the embers with an iron poker until flames leapt higher, lighting the lines carved deep in his brow. His jaw locked tight, his eyes gray beneath a veil of sorrow. He glanced back at Clara, gaze neither soft nor harsh. You can stay the night. Come morning, when the storm eases, I'll take you to Fort Banner. Clara bowed her head, no protest on her lips. She had no other choice. Her back ached, her feet were numb, her body spent. However cold this house might be, it was still the only shield between her and the merciless blizzard. She noted the cabin's stillness. Battered chairs, a scarred table, scattered tools. No laughter, no trace of warmth. All seemed frozen from the day the woman in the portrait vanished. Clara stepped nearer the fire, held her raw hands to the glow. Ellie shadowed her every move, eyes lifting now and then, fearful Clara might vanish. Clara forced a fragile smile, bent low and whispered, "It's all right, darling. We're all right." But she knew the words were more for herself than the child. Thomas watched in silence. At last he poured hot water from a blackened kettle into a chipped porcelain cup and set it on the table. He gestured. Clara wrapped trembling hands around it, the steam warming her cheeks, loosening the frost that clung inside her veins. No one spoke. Only the fire's crackle, the storm's cry against the walls, and the thunder of Clara's heart filled the room. She knew the night would be long. Morning was uncertain, but for now she had survived within these walls, and that was enough. The flames climbed, gilding the dust-laden portrait in shifting light. Clara glanced once, then turned away, aware she had no right to fill that absence. She was only a stranger, borrowing shelter where warmth had died long ago. Thomas stood broad-shouldered by the hearth, the faint gleam of his wedding band catching firelight, a silent reminder that once there had been love, a family, now reduced to silence and shadow. Clara drew a breath, closed her eyes. Whatever came with the dawn, she would endure the night. The pale dawn of Wyoming slipped through the shuttered windows in threads of gold, fine as spun silk, falling across the cabin's rough walls. Outside, the blizzard had broken, though the wind still lashed in steady gusts, drumming low against the roof. Clara woke from a night of restless half-sleep. Her body ached, her back stiff from the hard, cold bed, yet she had survived the storm. When she stepped into the main room, the air still smelled of wood smoke, Thomas was already gone, though signs of his mourning lingered. Only Ellie sat at the wooden table, legs dangling, feet not touching the floor. Before her lay a sheet of paper, its corner creased from folding. In her small hand was a charcoal stub, scratching lines across the page. As Clara drew closer, the child looked up without a word and pushed the paper toward her. Clara bent to see. 3 stick figures stood there. One tall man, one woman with long hair, and a child between them, holding both their hands. Above them, in clumsy letters, a single word: Mama. Clara's chest tightened. Crude, simple, yet every stroke pierced her like a needle. One word, carrying a hunger deeper than measure. She parted her lips, but her voice broke. At last she only smoothed the girl's hair, nodding in silent answer. Ellie gave a faint smile, then swiftly hid another sheet behind her back and fled to the small room beyond. Clara lingered in silence. She felt as though an invisible cord had bound her to this child, though she was nothing but a stranger blown here by chance. To distract herself, she turned to tidying. As she cleared the table and folded old clothes stacked in the cupboard, her hand brushed against a yellowed envelope wedged between the fabric. Instinct told her to put it back, but her gaze caught the faded words upon its face. Medical report. Her hands shook as she slid it open. Inside was a single sheet, neat handwriting, sharp as a blade. Wounds have healed. The patient may live long and well. However, the damage to the lower abdomen is permanent. The ability to bear children, nearly impossible. The room blurred. Clara no longer felt the wind's whistle outside, only the pounding of her heart. It was the very letter she had once received, years ago, after the explosion that nearly stole her life. She had carried it with her, hidden it, never letting another soul see. Yet here it was, uncovered in a house not her own. She shoved it into her dress pocket, but too late. A voice, deep and gravelly, spoke behind her. "What is that?" She started, whirled. Thomas stood in the doorway, hair still dusted with snow, coat frosted white, his gray eyes fixed on the envelope in her hand. Clara could not speak. Her throat clamped shut, her body rigid. Thomas moved past her to the hearth. Without another glance, he knelt, set iron to the coals, fed in thick logs. Fire flared, red light flickering across his face, carving deeper the lines etched there. He asked nothing. He pressed no questions. Only that slow, deliberate act of tending flame. Clara clutched the envelope as though it burned her skin, braced for pity, for judgment, that she was broken, unfit to be wife or mother. But none came. Thomas set the poker aside, rose and said simply, "The wind's still strong. The window in your room is loose. I'll see it shut." He turned away, leaving Clara rooted like stone. Her chest convulsed, tears pricking but held back. His silence was heavier than sympathy, heavier than scorn. He had neither questioned nor pitied, neither embraced nor cast her off. He had only fed the fire, mended warmth into the house as if patching holes without words. Clara sank into a chair, hands gripping the envelope on her lap. Outside, the wind whipped snow from the eaves in sheets. Within, the fire burned on, throwing its light over the portrait of the woman who had once lived here. For the first time in years, Clara's heart quaked not from cold, but from fear. The fear that her past had finally caught her. that the truth she had buried was now laid bare before this stranger. Ellie suddenly appeared, clutching the broken wooden horse, placing it beside Clara's chair. She looked up, lips trembling, yet no words came. Her eyes, clear and bright, seemed to say she needed no explanations, only that Clara remain, only that she not leave. Clara forced a smile, bent to stroke the child's hair. But inside, her thoughts surged like storm waves. The envelope weighed heavy in her hand, a scar she could not erase. Thomas stood at the fire, his gaze locked upon the flames. His face betrayed nothing, yet his shadow stretched long across the floor, wavering with each flicker. Clara knew he had seen enough to understand, and she knew then, from that moment forward, her deepest secret was no longer hers alone. The days that followed crept by slow, each hour stretched thin as only a Wyoming winter could make it. Heavy, endless, and still. Snow sealed the yard, wind moaned against the eaves, and within the cabin at Raven Hill Ranch, life that had once seemed frozen began to stir, fragile yet weighted. Clara found a rhythm. Each morning she took the old Bible from the shelf and read aloud to Ellie. Her voice never rose above a murmur, just enough to mingle with the crackle of the fire. The child sat close, eyes wide, watching Clara's lips more than listening to the words. Yet Clara saw it, the rare glint of attention, as if each syllable opened a door within her. In the afternoons, when light thinned through the frosted panes, Clara threaded a needle and placed it in Ellie's hands, guiding her through clumsy stitches. The girl's fingers fumbled, pricked red, tangling the thread. Clara did not scold, did not seize the work away, but laid her own hand gently over the small one, steadying each pass of the needle. The stitches were crooked, the fabric puckered, yet in time a shape took form. And when Ellie looked up, a faint smile curved her lips, the first Clara had ever seen upon her. The warmth that rushed Clara's chest nearly brought tears. It was not a radiant grin, but to her it was a sunbeam breaking through storm. She returned the smile, a peace settling over her she had not felt in years. Often, Thomas lingered at a distance, leaning in the doorway or standing in shadow. He rarely spoke, rarely intervened, yet his gray eyes missed nothing. When Clara stitched with Ellie, he mended the squealing hinge of the door. When she struggled with the cracked kettle, he took his tools and reforged its handle. When smoke thickened the room, he shifted the chimney. Always wordless, always plain, but Clara recognized the shape of care in every act, even when wrapped in his stern silence. The days seemed calm, but beneath them, the cabin still held fractures no fire could seal. Shadows of the past lingered, waiting for night. One evening, as snow fell harder and the wind tore at the shutters, Clara woke to its shriek through the seams of her window. She wrapped herself in a shawl, stepped into the main room to feed the hearth. The fire was nearly dead, its glow faint against the portrait of the woman on the wall, the dust upon her face seeming all the heavier. Clara bent to lift the poker when she heard a rustling sound. She turned. Ellie sat hunched at the table, bare feet curled beneath her, paper spread wide, a box of charcoal at hand. The fire's weak light traced her features, eyes wide, intent, unnaturally focused. "You're not asleep?" Clara asked softly. The child gave no answer, her small hand moving with quick, harsh strokes. Clara stepped closer and froze. The paper bore no harmless doodles, no crooked shapes of play. It showed a woman fallen, and beside her, a shadow brandishing a knife. The charcoal pressed so hard it tore the page, dark streaks filling the floor, thick as blood spilling across the wood. Clara's breath stopped. The silence of the cabin deepened. Only the snap of wood in the fire, the storm's wail, and the thunder of her own pulse filled her ears. Her hand trembled as she lifted the sheet, eyes locked upon the dreadful image. A woman, a shadow, blood. She looked to Ellie. The child sat still. No tears, no fear. Her dark eyes were deep wells, holding memories no 6-year-old should carry. Clara sank beside her, clutching the drawing. Her voice rasped. "Ellie, what is this? What have you drawn?" The child said nothing. Her hand, blackened with charcoal, clutched the pencil tighter. She curled in upon herself, arms wrapped around her chest, face turned away. Clara's skin prickled cold. This was no child's play, no idle sketch. The lines were too fierce, too real, as though some memory had been poured onto the page. She thought of the fleeting smile earlier, of the light in Ellie's eyes at scripture, of the tiny hand trusting in hers. And now, those same hands had etched terror onto paper. The fire flared, then dipped, casting the portrait above in lurid shadow. Clara swallowed hard. This house was no longer a refuge. It felt like a coffin, holding grief unburied. Ellie shoved the charcoal box shut, pushed the drawing aside as if to deny it. Her eyes shone with tears, but her lips stayed sealed. Clara pulled her into her arms. The child shook, but did not resist, her breath coming ragged against Clara's shoulder. Clara clutched the drawing to her chest, knowing she held more than paper. She held a shard of darkness. Whatever past haunted this house, she had touched its edge tonight. By the dim glow of the hearth, Clara sat unmoving, Ellie trembling in her embrace, and the haunting sketch lying before them, a grim reminder that the peace here was only a thin veil stretched over something terrible, waiting to be named. The fire in the hearth had burned low, little more than red embers buried in ash. Clara sat staring at the drawing on the table, the grotesque scrawl that she could not look away from. When Thomas entered, boots crunching with snow, she started, hand instinctively sliding over the page. He stood still for a long moment, eyes flicking downward before resting on her face. In the dull amber glow, his gray eyes darkened. Clara bit her lip, her heart hammering. She knew silence could hold no longer. "Thomas," her hand trembled as she laid the paper bare. "Ellie, she drew this." His gaze lingered on the crude bloodstains, the shadow with the knife. His jaw clenched, cords standing at his neck. At last he sank into a chair, heavy as felled timber. For a long time only the wind groaned against the walls. Then his voice came, hoarse, torn from some pit within him. "That night, I was drunk." Clara froze, her hands cold. "When I woke," he halted, drew a breath, his eyes shut tight. "There was only blood. Blood on my shirt, on the floor. And she was gone." The fire's glow licked across his face, carving the lines deeper like scars. Clara's fingers dug into her skirt, throat tight, listening. "I searched, but found nothing. Only Ellie upstairs, crying until her voice gave out. The law came, shook their heads, said she'd left. But me," his head bowed, his voice cracking, "I remembered nothing. Only the drink. Only the dark." Clara's breath caught. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down. She stared at the drawing, at Ellie's silent eyes from nights past. Clearly that night held more than had ever been spoken. Sleep eluded her till dawn. The storm outside keened like whispers of the dead. Dread coiled in her chest. Clara knew that if she did not seek the truth, she would drown in this house's secrets. The next morning, while Thomas went to the stables, Clara wrapped her shawl and stepped into the snow. The path wound toward the foot of the hill, blanketed white. After half an hour, she reached a small shack, smoke trailing from a leaning chimney. An old woman opened the door, thin frame swathed in a frayed shawl. A long scar cut across her neck, making her face severe. One eye clouded, the other sharp as a hawk's. "Who are you?" she rasped. I'm staying at Ravenhill Ranch." Clara steadied her voice. "I need to ask about that night." The crone narrowed her gaze, then stepped aside. Inside, the hut was cramped, smoke-laden. Herbs hung in bundles from the beams, sharp with their pungent scent. Clara sat, hands trembling. "That night, 3 years passed. Did you hear anything?" The woman paused, her good eye gleaming in firelight. "I heard a scream at midnight, but I did not go out. My husband, before he died, always warned me, 'In the prairie night, seek no trouble.' And so I stayed." Clara held her breath. "And the morning after?" The old woman's voice dropped low. "I saw tracks. 2 left the ranch. Only 1 returned." Clara's heart clenched. "Did you tell the law?" The woman let out a dry, bitter laugh. "The law? The sheriff was Thomas's cousin, a McAllister. He came, looked once, told me to keep silent, said the family needed no scandal, and I had no strength to fight him." She fixed Clara with a look, pity flickering in the clouded eye. "Girl, if you stay there, remember this. That house holds more than wind and shadow. It holds a truth buried deep beneath the snow." Clara sat rigid, hands clenched. Outside, snow fell soft, swallowing the horizon. Within her, a storm was rising. She thanked the woman and turned back. Each step marked the snow like ink pressed onto a page, a weight carving into memory. Thomas's broken confession, the old woman's warning, all of it twisted into a single knot of dread. When at last the cabin loomed through the haze, Clara paused at the porch. Inside, Thomas bent over the fire, feeding wood. Ellie rested at the table, head slumped against her wooden horse. It looked a picture of peace, yet to Clara it reeked of ghosts. She stepped inside, unwrapped her shawl, and laid a hand upon the drawing from the night before. The charcoal strokes were still sharp, the red imagined stains still raw. Clara knew the truth was stirring beneath the snow, and once it rose fully into light, no one beneath this roof would ever stand unchanged. That afternoon, the Wyoming sky hung heavy and gray, a blanket of iron pressing down upon the prairie. The wind still lashed, though the snow had ceased, leaving the air sharp and brittle with expectation. Thomas led his horse southward, his tall frame fading into the lines of fence posts until the storm haze swallowed him whole. Inside, Clara remained at the table with Ellie. The child worried a scrap of cloth in her trembling hands, attempting clumsy stitches under Clara's patient guidance. Outwardly, it was a scene of quiet, yet Clara's heart still carried the shadows of Thomas's confession and the widow's hushed warning. The sudden rhythm of hooves broke across the silence, a steady beat, heavy and measured, echoing across the barren stretch. Clara's head lifted, her pulse tightening. In this land, a rider who came unannounced rarely bore good tidings. The figure grew clear. A broad-shouldered man draped in a dust-stained cloak, his face weathered, beard unkempt. His horse staggered beneath him, lathered with sweat, its eyes rimmed red. As they neared, he pulled the reins, gaze fixed upon the ranch. Clara's arm closed firm around Ellie, every instinct on edge. The boards of the porch quivered as the hooves stopped just beyond. The man swung down, boots thudding hard upon the frozen earth. He stripped off his hat, revealing damp, disheveled hair, and strode forward, each step deliberate, echoing. When Clara opened the door, he was already there, shadow filling the threshold. "Name's Jonas Danner," he said, voice deep and coarse, half greeting, half decree. "I worked here once, Raven Hill Ranch." His eyes swept the room, pausing on Clara before probing deeper, as though searching for something lost or owed. There was fatigue in his frame, but beneath it, a chill that set Clara's blood running cold. She stepped back instinctively. "Thomas isn't here," she answered, steadying her voice. "He's out in the fields." Jonas gave a slow nod, a shadow of a smile curling his lips, unsettling in its vagueness. "I know. Just thought I'd see how the old place stands." At that instant, Ellie appeared in the doorway of her small room. Her wide eyes locked upon the stranger. Then a scream tore from her throat, sharp, piercing, a cry that split the still air. "No!" She bolted back, feet pounding, vanishing into the room. Clara's heart lurched. She rushed after, finding the child crammed beneath the bed, trembling, clutching a piece of charcoal. With frantic strokes, Ellie scrawled across the wooden floor. Clara dropped to her knees, staring as the shapes took form. A tall man, knife in hand, blood thick and sprawling. Beside it, the figure of a woman fallen. Her throat seized. The picture was no fancy, but a memory clawed from the child's silence. "Ellie," Clara whispered, reaching toward her. "It's all right. I'm here." The girl did not answer. She gripped the charcoal tighter, scrawling, more blood until her fingertips turned black. Clara pulled her close, though the child writhed, soundless sobs breaking her body. Clara held fast, trembling, whispering over and over, "You're safe now. Safe." Outside, Jonas's boots scraped across the porch, pacing slow, deliberate, each step a weight upon the boards. Clara felt her heart pound like war drums, cold sweat beading her brow. She knew then this was no casual visit. Ellie's terror came raw and instinctive, born of memory, of something witnessed and never spoken. Clara dragged her from beneath the bed, holding her against her chest. Her eyes caught the unfinished scrawl on the floor, the blackened figure with a blade, the wash of imagined blood. It matched Thomas's fractured confession, the widow's whispered truth. A chill raced down Clara's spine. The storm had never left this house. It had only been waiting, and now it had returned, in the form of the stranger named Jonas Danner. She clutched Ellie tighter, feeling the child's frantic heartbeat hammer against her own. Tears streaked down the girl's face, her body quaking. In the dimming light, the charcoal smears blurred, like memories bleeding back into the open. Clara did not know how Thomas would face this upon his return. She knew only one thing. The fragile calm of the past days was shattered, and in the timbered walls of Raven Hill Ranch, the old darkness was opening its eyes once more. The footsteps on the porch stopped cold. Clara clutched Ellie tight against her chest, every nerve straining for sound. Then, without warning, the door burst open. A blast of winter wind roared through, scattering ash from the hearth and whipping her hair into her face. Jonas Danner stood in the threshold, his eyes glittering with a cold, merciless light. He wasted no word of warning. One stride carried him deep into the room. Clara had no time to flee before he struck her aside. Her back slammed against the boards, pain exploding up her spine. Ellie's scream split the air, shrill and raw. The knife flashed, steel catching the fire's glow as it plunged downward like lightning. Clara threw herself forward, wrapping her body over Ellie's small frame. Pain tore through her shoulder as the blade sank in, blood hot and sudden flooding her dress. She cried out, but her arms never loosened. She shielded the child. "Up!" Jonas roared, yanking her by the shoulder, trying to drag them both free of the corner. His eyes were wild, animal, a frenzy of hunger and rage. Clara fought weakly, Ellie clinging to her neck, sobbing soundlessly, her small hands clutching like a drowning soul's grip. Then a gunshot split the air, deafening, final. Glass rattled, powder smoke filled the cabin. Jonas staggered, a groan ripping from his chest. One hand clutched his side, blood welling, spilling down his coat in a dark tide. In the doorway stood Thomas, his face hard as iron, gray eyes blazing with a fury Clara had never seen. The pistol still smoked in his hand. "Danner!" he hissed through his teeth. Jonas dropped to his knees, yet managed a twisted grin. "So, you're not dead in your drink after all. I came back to finish what was left undone." Thomas strode in, gun raised steady. Clara crouched on the floor, still wrapped around Ellie, blood pouring from her wound. The pain seared with every breath, but she held fast. The door crashed open again. Villagers rushed in, drawn by the shot. Men carried ropes, clubs. In moments, Jonas was pinned, his arms bound, forced to the ground. His blood spread across the boards, mingling with Clara's, painting the floor in a grisly mosaic. Ellie trembled in Clara's arms, then suddenly broke into a sob, fierce and raw, shattering years of silence. Her cry rang out, "Mama! Don't leave me!" The world stopped. The wind outside stilled. The clamor of the men fell away. Only Ellie's voice remained, echoing, tearing through the cabin's long silence. Clara's breath caught, tears burning. She bent close, blood staining her hair, her lips quivering. "I won't leave you. Never." Thomas dropped to his knees beside them, pressing cloth to Clara's wound, his hands shaking. His eyes darted from the child to her, as though for the first time he understood they were bound into his fate. Jonas, trussed and bleeding, let out a hoarse laugh. The girl finally speaks, but that word, he grimaced, shuddering. "Oh, it's not for your wife, it's for this stranger." Thomas struck him, sending him sprawling. The men dragged Jonas out, bound and snarling, his curses breaking into a howl. His final words bled into the air. "My blood will haunt this place yet." The door slammed shut. Only Clara, Thomas, and Ellie remained. Clara slumped, gasping. Thomas pressed hard against her wound, voice rough, pleading, "Don't close your eyes. I won't let you go." Ellie buried her face against Clara's chest, tears soaking the blood-stained fabric. The word "mama" lingered, not from a grown woman's lips, but from a small heart that had found its voice after 3 long years. The cabin reeked of powder, of blood, of grief. Yet within that chaos, for the first time, Clara felt she was no longer a wanderer. In Ellie's cry, she had been called by name, sacred, undeniable. All her scars, her years of loss, every shadow she had carried seemed to lead to this single moment. She did not know what tomorrow held, whether her wound would scar, whether the darkness outside would return. But in her arms was a child reborn into voice, and that voice had made everything real. After the violence, Ravenhill Ranch felt emptier than ever. Danner had been dragged away in chains, yet his shadow clung to the wood itself, to the stains of dried blood across the boards. The air remained thick with the reek of gunpowder, of spent ash, of iron and blood. Clara lay upon the narrow guest bed, her shoulder wrapped in white bandages, crimson still seeping through the cloth. Each movement stabbed bone-deep pain through her body. Yet what haunted her was not the wound, but Thomas's eyes that night, and Ellie's scream. "Mama, don't leave me!" echoed in her ears, a blade pressing deeper with every heartbeat. Night after night, sleep fled her. When the pain dulled, guilt surged. She thought of the medical report Thomas had seen, the verdict upon her body, that she could never bear children. And now, with Ellie's fragile voice breaking silence to call her mother, Clara felt she was living a lie. She loved the child with all her soul, yet in her depths believed she could never be enough to fill the space of a true mother. One morning, with fog coiling across the prairie, Thomas had gone to the stables, Ellie still asleep on the chair by the fire. Clara sat at the wooden table, faint light slanting through the window. In her hand, a worn pencil. Before her, a blank page. She breathed deep and began to write. "Thomas, I know you've seen the medical letter. I cannot bear children, and that will never change. I can care for Ellie. I can love her with all I have, but I cannot give you the family you deserve. You need another woman, someone who can give you a full home, new children, a future unbroken. I can only offer a part, never the whole. I know I've taken too much already, from you, from her, but I cannot hold this kindness forever. That is why I leave, before I become another burden." Her hand shook with every word. A tear fell, smudging the ink, yet she forced herself to finish. At last she signed, "Clara." She placed the letter on the mantel, beneath the portrait of Thomas's wife. To leave it there was her confession. She would never replace that face. Clara returned to her room, gathering the few things she owned, but her hands froze at a sound behind her. Turning, she saw Ellie in the doorway, hair tangled, eyes heavy with sleep. The child rubbed her eyes, then wandered into the main room. Clara's breath seized. She tried to stop her, but it was too late. Ellie saw the letter. The small hands lifted it, eyes moving across the scrawled lines. She did not read aloud, but Clara saw her lips shape the words. At the line, "I cannot give you a whole family," her hand trembled. When she reached her own name written within, "I can care for Ellie, but—" She froze. Tears welled. Her gaze blurred. "Ellie," Clara's voice cracked, but the child did not look up. She clutched the letter to her chest, breathing fast, then turned and fled. The door slammed to her room. Clara collapsed into a chair, hands over her face, her heart splitting. She thought of rising, of following, but her wound chained her still. She prayed the child might understand, but she was wrong. By afternoon, before Thomas returned, Clara sensed the silence was wrong. The house was too still. She hurried to the small room, empty. The bed still warm, the blanket rumpled. The window stood ajar, curtain whipping in the cold wind. Clara rushed to it, and her eyes fell on the tracks, small feet pressed deep into the snow. Her heart stopped. Ellie was gone. The words of her letter burned in her skull. I cannot give you a whole family. The child had read, had believed herself the burden. Clara's shame had cut her like a blade. Clara stumbled into the storm, snow lashing her face, wind clawing her skin. She screamed the name until her throat tore. Ellie! Ellie! Only the wind answered, hollow and cruel. Her heart shattered. All she had meant to protect, all she had tried to hide, had driven the child away. In despair, Clara dropped to her knees in the snow, tears streaming, blood seeping fresh through her bandage, staining the white beneath her. Once again, she had lost everything. And this time it was by her own hand that the child had been driven into the storm. The snow whipped Clara's face raw, the wind howling like a death trumpet. She stumbled from the house, her boots sinking to the ankle, her voice breaking as she cried into the storm. Ellie, where are you? The gale shredded her words, carrying them away into the white void. Thomas came running from the barn, saw her collapsed on the porch, her bandage soaked crimson where the wound had torn open again. He caught her arm, voice urgent and low. What happened? Ellie, she's gone. She read the letter. Clara gasped. Thomas froze, gray eyes flaring. He rushed inside, snatched the paper from the mantel. As the firelight struck the words, Clara staggered behind him, her heart stalling. It was not the letter she had written. The hand was hers, yet twisted, lines warped, words sharpened cruel. I could never love Ellie. I will not bear the burden of a child not my own. I must leave as far as I can. Clara clutched her head, tears streaming. No, that's not mine. I only wrote of not being able to bear children. Thomas studied the page, his jaw taut. The strokes are stretched, the ink smudged. Another hand touched this. The silence was heavy with the truth. Only one man had both reason and reach. The sheriff cousin, who had buried the disappearance of Thomas's wife 3 years past. He wants to break us, Thomas muttered, voice raw. Clara's chest heaved. But Ellie, she believed every word. The storm roared as if to remind them time was bleeding away. A 6-year-old alone in such a blizzard might not last an hour. Thomas bolted for the barn, threw a saddle upon his great stallion. He swung up, reaching a hand for Clara. We cannot lose her. She swallowed pain and clambered up behind him. They spurred into the white fury, snow slicing their faces. The world narrowed to the thunder of hooves and Clara's hands clinging tight. Ellie! Clara screamed, her voice ragged. Ellie! Only the wind answered, and the pounding of hooves upon snow. They hunted for the prints of small feet, but the gale had erased most. Now and then a faint track glimmered, then vanished again. Clara bit her lip until blood mingled with tears, her eyes raking the void. Fields fell behind them, then a black fringe of trees. Time melted away, each heartbeat dragging heavier. Clara's wound burned, yet her heart ached worse. Then the moon cracked through cloud, casting a silver shard across the drifts. Clara's cry tore out. There! Beneath an ancient wind-scoured tree, a small shape crouched, shivering. Thomas wrenched the reins, leapt from the saddle before the horse halted. Clara nearly tumbled, but she was already running, falling to her knees in the snow. Ellie! The child sagged against the tree, clutching a ragged doll, lips blue, eyes half shut. Clara gathered her up, crushed her close. No, no, baby, don't leave me. I was wrong, I'll never leave you. Ellie trembled, her breath a wisp. I thought you didn't want me. No, Clara sobbed, tears falling upon her dark hair. You are everything. You are the reason I breathe. Thomas dropped beside them, tearing off his coat, wrapping it around them all. His broad hands enclosed them, his forehead pressed close, voice breaking. Enough! No one will take us apart again. From this day, we are a family. Clara wept, holding Ellie tighter, feeling the fragile heartbeat still fluttering. Beneath that tree, within the storm, 3 broken souls bound themselves together, not by blood, not by fate, but by choice. The wind raged, the snow cut merciless, yet in their embrace a fire glowed, a flame no storm could quench. That spring came late to Wyoming, yet with a gentleness that felt like grace. After months of blizzards burying all in white, the sky above Raven Hollow broke open with golden light. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides, sparrows trilled from budding branches, and streams ran clear as glass, as if the land itself exhaled at last after a long, dark winter. The little wooden church had been scrubbed and mended, windows polished, shingles patched, the walls newly whitewashed. On that day, the townsfolk gathered in full, faces once shadowed by Raven Hill Ranch's tragedies, now lit with wonder and goodwill. They had come not merely for a wedding, but to bear witness to a resurrection, the rebirth of a family thought forever broken. Clara stood in a small chamber behind the altar, where stained glass light spilled upon the floor in shades of violet and gold. She wore a plain white dress borrowed from the town seamstress, cotton humble yet stitched with care. Wild blossoms crowned her dark hair. In the mirror, her face seemed pale, lined by what she had endured, yet her eyes glowed, no longer trembling as they had that first night at the ranch door. Ellie entered, clad in a simple blue frock that Clara had helped her piece together from old cloth. In her hands, she carried a basket brimming with petals, her eyes bright as stars. She looked up and whispered, soft but certain, "Mama, you're beautiful." Clara bent and drew her close, tears swelling, but this time they were tears of joy. Beyond, the organ swelled, summoning them forward. Benches creaked as the townsfolk rose, turning toward the door. Thomas already stood at the altar, the great window casting him in light. He wore a freshly pressed white shirt, dark trousers, boots shined. His hair was still unruly, yet his face shone, his gray eyes no longer clouded, but calm, steady, and filled with peace. The old wedding band glinted faintly on his hand, soon to be laid aside for a new beginning. The chapel doors swung wide. Ellie went first, scattering white petals with a sure step, her small chin lifted high. Her voice rang out, clear and bold, "I give Mama to Papa." Laughter rippled through the pews, followed by applause. Faces once narrowed in doubt now glistened with tears. The child's words, simple and pure, sanctified the moment beyond ritual. Clara followed, step by step, eyes fixed only on Thomas. Sunlight gilded her hair brighter than any veil could. The memories of storms, of blood upon floorboards, of nights spent writing in despair, all receded. Only the present remained, the man waiting for her, and the child leading her with petals. At the altar, Thomas reached for her. She laid her hand trembling into his, and his hand closed firm, steady, warm. The pastor's voice rose, old yet resonant. Today, before God and community, we witness a family reborn from loss and a love found in the heart of winter's storm. A quiet amen flowed through the room. Clara bowed her head, tears slipping free, but her smile held. Thomas tightened his grasp, his eyes alight with a vow deeper than words. Ellie stood near, her gaze never wavering. She was no longer the silent child of 3 lost years. She smiled, cheeks flushed, radiant, for she knew this was not only a wedding. This was the day she gained a family, holy and forever. The organ thundered, joyous, as the pastor's blessing ended. Applause erupted, filling the chapel, washing away the old whispers of cruelty and suspicion. Laughter and warmth spilled where silence and grief had once reigned. Clara lifted her eyes to Thomas. Her lips trembled, but he bent close, whispering, "We've come this far. Nothing will part us again." And in that instant, Clara felt it true. The chains of the past had fallen away. She was no longer the wanderer who knocked upon a door in the storm. She was wife. She was mother. And she was called by name in the light of spring. When the final chords of the organ faded, the chapel doors flung wide. Spring sunlight poured in, gilding every wooden pew and every radiant face. The townsfolk rose, applause rolling like thunder. Clara, Thomas, and Ellie walked out hand in hand, 3 frayed strands woven at last into one unbreakable cord. Beyond the church stretched the prairie, where new grass pushed through the melting snow. A gentle breeze replaced the howling storms of winter. Children tossed handfuls of petals, old men smiled kindly, and hands clapped Thomas's shoulder, brushed Clara's arm with warmth. No more whispers of doubt, no more glances of scorn. Only welcome, only blessing. By evening, they returned to the ranch. Before the hearth they sat, the fire blazing red, heart-like in its glow. Clara leaned against Thomas's shoulder, Ellie curled in her lap with the worn doll tight in her arms. In the shifting light, Thomas slowly slid from his finger the ring he had worn 3 years, a heavy relic of love and grief. The metal gleamed one last time before he placed it gently in Clara's palm. "Family," he said, voice low, steady, "is not where we are born. Family is where we choose to stay." Clara's tears fell, her hand closing around the ring, feeling the weight of sorrow now forged into courage. Ellie lifted her head, eyes bright, and wrapped her small arms around them both. "I don't need anything else. Just Mama and Papa." The words broke Clara open. She drew Ellie close, her arm reaching for Thomas. The 3 pressed together as if the fire itself dwelt within their embrace. "I was not born to be a mother," Clara whispered, trembling yet sure, "but I was called to become one." Her vow filled the room, needing no reply. Thomas lowered his head, kissed her brow, and in his eyes the firelight shone with quiet promise. Ellie clung to them, and silence reigned, no longer hollow, but whole. Night fell across the prairie, yet inside the cabin the fire burned bright. Witness to a truth no storm could erase. A family had been made, not by blood nor by paper, but by sacrifice, by tears, and by the courage to stay. Ellie drifted into sleep against Clara's chest, her breath steady, her face at peace. Clara kissed her dark hair, feeling the gravity and the gift of it all. Thomas pulled a wool blanket over them, sitting in stillness, as if to etch the sight into memory forever. Outside, the wind still moved, but no longer with menace, only the steady breath of the west. Inside, the blaze glowed steady, its warmth binding them together. From blood, from loss, from storm and shadow, a home had risen again. Not tragedy, but beginning. Not waiting, but belonging. And in each other's arms they knew, family need not be perfect. Family need only be chosen. When dawn broke, its first light spilled pink across the cabin walls. Thomas rose, yet for once did not go to the stables. Instead, he lingered, watching the two forms asleep upon the settee. Ellie clutched Clara close. Clara's arm curved firm around her child, as if to keep the world at bay. He understood then. A man's strength is not his gun, nor his land, but his choice to remain, to hold what he loves. For 3 years he had lived in fear. But courage was not the quick draw of a pistol. It was laying aside the old ring and opening himself to new love. Clara stirred, her gaze meeting his. They shared a smile, wordless yet complete. Ellie woke soon after, rubbed her eyes, and wrapped them both in a small but certain embrace. "Now I have a mama and a papa," she whispered, voice soft as wind, yet truer than any hymn. Their eyes stung with tears, but they held fast to one another. Outside, spring unfurled upon the prairie. Within Ravenhill Ranch, the fire still burned, not only to ward off cold, but to guard a future. Clara, Thomas, and Ellie would walk it together, no longer alone, no longer trembling in shadow. For any who have known loss, who feared joy had passed them by, their story bore a message. Love may come late, but its flame is never extinguished. Family need not be perfect. It need only be chosen, held fast, and lived fully in the moment. Beneath the timber roof of Raven Hill, the fire glowed proof. From sorrow can rise joy. Clara, Thomas, and Ellie had weathered storm and silence, and found one another in a family not born but made, chosen and steadfast. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, if your eyes blurred when Ellie's voice first cried, "Mama," leave us a sign, a like, a memory shared in the comments, or a blessing for those still searching for their way back to family. Subscribe to Wild West Love Echoes and journey with us through more tales of the frontier, where dust and wind only make love burn brighter. For some families are not born with us, but choose to walk with us all the way to the end.